Hi, my name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Trillium. Welcome to our video presentation, our summary of our worship service on Sunday. We're looking at this week the question of who does the resurrection belong to? Who does the resurrection belong to? You know, the ancient people, they had a really gloomy view of death. The Greeks understood death as a leading into the shadowlands, Hades. Only one in a million type of person, the most noblest or gifted of spirits, was elevated into the world of the gods at Olympus. And the Egyptians had that same point of view. And surprisingly, in the Old Testament, so did the Jews. They saw death in a very gloomy, pessimistic, somber way. For one thing, in one view at least, if you're dead, you're dead in the Old Testament. There really isn't anything beyond the death of the body. But in another view, spirits went to the world of Sheol, which was the equivalent of Hades for the Jews. And the Shadowlands. People lived in the Shadowlands. Some Jewish thinkers a couple hundred years before Jesus was born started to talk about a general resurrection, a meaningful existence beyond death for people. Talked about this general resurrection at the end of times when God would bring the age to a completion and God would bring a final judgment. And it's important for us to understand that for those Jewish thinkers, those Jewish philosophers and prophets, they saw this general resurrection and this final judgment as something enormously optimistic, something that was way better than what had been taught before. You see, in this world of final judgment, you had a 50-50 chance of making it in. Instead of a 1 in a million or a 1 in a billion chance, you had a 1 in 2 chance. And for ancient peoples of that kind of thinking, this was hugely optimistic. And Jesus and his first disciples certainly were part of that crowd that believed in the general resurrection and all the implications that went with it. And now Jesus, on Easter morning, is standing before the disciples. He's standing before them in a resurrected form, and resurrection is no longer some abstract ideal or idea. He's embodied it right before them in front of their eyes. And Paul was grafted into that community through his own experience of the risen Jesus on his way to Damascus. And now that's the great message he's taking out to those Corinthians. He's taking it out to the world, and it's what he brought to that Corinthian community, and it's what formed the foundation of that community in Corinth, that Christian community. Paul didn't proclaim Jesus wise teacher or good guy or great spirit. He proclaimed him as raised from the dead. Raised from the dead. It must have driven Paul kind of crazy a couple of years later to find out that some in the Corinthian church were denying the resurrection. Not for Jesus, but for other people. They were saying that Jesus was that 1 in a million, 1 in a billion, 1 in a trillion type guy that got elevated into the heavens to live with the gods, or in this case with God. But that wasn't not what Paul was teaching. He was saying that Jesus was the first fruits of something amazing that was going to happen, that the resurrection doesn't belong just to Jesus, but through Jesus it belongs to all people, that we're all part of this resurrected intention of God. God has this great plan for us. God wants us to be alive in spirit and in power through the resurrection of Jesus. And we're invited actually to begin this resurrected life today, not to wait for it when we die, but that the resurrected life has begun now because Jesus is alive. And that's the great message that we talked about in church on Sunday, that the resurrection belongs to us. It's not something that belongs only to Jesus or to an elite few, but it's meant to belong to all of us. And we can even see it in little ways in our life. We don't have to wait for just the big things. You know, when you stand up to that bully for the first time, you're engaged in resurrection because you're standing up again in a new way. And when you fall off the horse and you get back on again and you get on that horse and you ride it, you're engaged in resurrection. There's resurrection going on in your life at that moment. And when you meet a problem head on, and when you deal with your difficulties, and when you deal with your failures and your defeats in life, and you stand up again, and you stand up, that's what resurrection's about. Of course, that word resurrection means exactly that, to stand up again, to stand up in a new way, to stand afresh, to stand up in a way, be roused up, to be awakened up from the sleep. What about you and me this day? How are we living our lives? Do we want to be part of that resurrection life? And Paul's invitation to us is that, yes, you can be a part of it. You're meant to be a part of it. I'm meant to be a part of it. We're all people meant to be a part of that resurrection life. I'm hoping that you will take your own resurrection very seriously. Jesus, I believe, in a very literal sense, was raised from the dead and stood before those first disciples and in a way still stands before us in spirit. I believe in your literal resurrection too, that you're meant to be raised up in body and in spirit and in heart to a new life. And not just when you die, but in this moment. I pray for all the world that we may know the resurrected power of life in us. Be awakened to this truth. Come to know who you are this day. That's the great message for all of us. Many blessings to you. God bless.